Hello, everyone. So, I wanted to take some time to talk to you about the Ukraine war and the comments that you all made about it in the discussion. A few things I want to start out with is that obviously it's an ongoing situation and we have to watch to see what happens. The Ukrainians have really held their own against a much more powerful force so far, and there's many reasons for that. Some we are aware of and some we are not. But a few things that you folks mentioned about the war. One was the idea of how this war is being seen differently than others. We can look at what happened in Yemen, in Syria, and other wars in the last 10 years, and they have not gotten the same amount of press and interest as this war has. Now you have to ask why. What's the difference here? Well, there are several differences. A few people pointed to the fact that race plays a role. That Ukrainians are Europeans, they're Caucasians, and so there's a much greater affinity because of that shared culture. And so that didn't happen in other places in the world as much. And I think there's certainly some truth to that. I think that's one of the elements that plays into why we're paying so much attention now. It is not the only reason, though. There are other reasons that we're doing as much, and I think it has to do with the fact that this is a war that could spread and threaten the entire world. Nuclear weapons are involved, and that really is a great concern for many people. It's also in Europe, and we are much more oriented towards Europe historically than we are other parts of the world. So what are we to think about the issue of justice? And let's just talk a little bit about that, and then we'll move on. It's an important issue, of course. We've talked about it in the class many times. And yes, there is certainly a bias, a bias towards Europe, a bias towards white people, a bias towards the fact that a lot of Ukrainians have similar middle class lives than we do, and so on. And that creates more sympathy, more compassion than maybe it would for Yemenis or other places. And we have to think about that, and we have to look at that as a culture and as a people and what's important to us. And is it important to us to be able to see the world and experience the world in a more fair and equitable way? That's what we have to ask ourselves. The other thing is honestly that Russia has now invaded and done this to several places. It's not the first time. Ukraine was actually invaded by Russia a decade ago, and so were other countries in and around that area. And Russia is reacting to the world situation. So that's another thing we can talk about. Why is Russia doing this? What's causing Russia to act this way? Now, of course, everyone talks about Putin, and I think it's fair to point him out because he is an autocrat, he is in charge, and there's a cult of personality around him. But we have to look beyond just personalities here and look at what's happened in a much broader way to understand this war. So let's do some of that. One is that Russian history has great weight. All of history does. It has great momentum. You can't just ignore history and say, well, people should do what's right now and forget about what happened in the past. That would be nice, but it's just not the way it works. It never has been and it never will, because there is a cause and effect to history, and what's happening now has been caused by what happened in the past. Now, we have to hold two very different ideas in our heads at the same time. One, we have to hold Russia and whoever accountable for their actions. If Russia invaded a peaceful nation for no reason other than fear and paranoia, it seems, and so we have to hold them accountable. Two, the other idea is we have to understand the motivations behind why Russia invaded the Ukraine and see it as a historical continuation of many other events. I think it's fair to do both and not one or the other. And the other thing we need to think about as well, some of you mentioned that the United States has been involved in a great deal of conflict and war in recent history. And that also plays a role. That also plays a role in how Russia is behaving now, and other countries as well. So that's something also we can talk about. So first, Russia is a country that has been probably more than most, if not all, battered by invasions themselves. They have been invaded many times. Last major invasion was by Hitler, and that caused the deaths of something like 20 million Russians. Now, think about it. In the United States, we lost 500,000 people in World War II. The Russians lost 40 times as many people as we did. And World War II is incredibly important to us. The United States was never invaded. Russia was invaded. So that act left a powerful psychic legacy in the Russian people. And it wasn't the only one. The Russians have been invaded before. So there is this real historical resonance with being threatened by Europe and other countries. And so Russia is kind of paranoid about that. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, they wanted to make sure that their national security interests were met, that they would be safe. And their biggest historical adversary was NATO from the Cold War. And they wanted to make sure that NATO did not encroach on their country and create national security threats and invasion threats. And so they've been acting accordingly, and they've been feeling justified in having these extensions of war. That is a part of it. And what we could have done differently, I think, in the United States and Europe, is we could have done the same thing that happened after World War II, when the Nazis were defeated, when Italy and Germany and Japan were defeated. What the United States did was a Marshall Plan, a plan to get them up and running, to support them, to give them economic, political, cultural, social aid in order for them to really pick themselves up as quickly as possible. And that obviously cost a great deal of money, but it was a matter of also self-interest. The United States did as much because we know from history very clearly that a battered people often turn to dictatorships, to autocracy. And we were very concerned that the Europeans and the Japanese would do that after World War II. So by helping them economically to, recover quickly, we helped set in a much more likely chance that they would go democratic. And in fact, that's what happened. We could have done that with Russia. We could have, once the Soviet Union fell, had a kind of new Marshall Plan for them to help them reestablish themselves, and we largely did not. We didn't do that. We could also have created new security institutions, or maybe invited Russia into NATO or something to that effect to allay some of their fears. We did not do that either. So at the same time, the United States has, in the last 10 to 15 to 20 years, also been involved in invading other countries and setting the tone. So that all of that is significant in what's happening today. So as much as we need to hold Russia accountable for their actions, and they do need to be held accountable because they're doing some horrible things to the Ukrainian people, we also have to understand that what we do has relevance for the future. What we do today is going to affect the future, and there's no getting away from that. So we have to make wise decisions today. And we are only going to be able to do that if we acknowledge the mistakes we've made in the past. And we have made mistakes. And I hope that we do that as a world. I hope that we can have some truth and reconciliation about the mistakes we have made. In terms of Russia, what should specifically they be held accountable for? Not just in this war, but as we saw in the For Sama video, in their brutal disregard of civilian safety. In fact, in many ways, they've actually targeted civilians in order to create political change, win a war, essentially. What happens when you target hospitals and you target civilians is it causes people to despair and be more willing to accommodate to the invader's needs. But it sometimes doesn't do that, right? Sometimes it has the opposite effect and creates more resistance. So it's a tactical gamble that countries make. However, we do have laws of conduct in war, international civilized laws of conduct, and one of those is not to bomb hospitals and not to target civilians. And so Russia has broken those laws. And they're largely laws that the countries agree to. Although there is a global court, it doesn't necessarily have that power in all cases, especially when it's dealing with large, very powerful nations that don't have to do what the international community says. So we have all that to deal with in the future now. The real key issue here is also not just about the Ukrainian people, but what happens to our world when we return to the might is right mentality of the past. This is something that we actually evolved out of after World War II, when we created institutions, global institutions, that respected other nations' integrity and sovereignty. And it wasn't a perfect system by any means. The United Nations could not always achieve those goals. But if you look at history, in the last 75 to 80 years, there's been virtually no kind of wars of imperial expansion that we used to see all the time across all of history for thousands of years. We've managed to really put a stop to that in the last generations. And now, if this war is successful for Russia, it could precipitate a change back to that kind of world, which would mean we'd have to invest a lot more money in the military. And every dollar that we put in building tanks and weapons and defensive systems is a dollar we don't have to help our society develop, for teachers, for hospitals, for infrastructure, for all kinds of needs that we have in the world, desperate needs today, and also for the great challenge that we're facing of mitigating the effects of climate catastrophe. So we don't want to go back to that kind of world for so many reasons. And that's what's really key about this war, that it has that potential. And lastly, we have the issue of thermonuclear weapons. We have been fortunate that we've been able to put that out of our minds mostly in the last 2 or 3 decades since the fall of the Soviet Union. But these weapons are still there. They're still incredibly powerful and incredibly destructive. And yes, we've drawn down from, I think at the height of the Cold War, there was maybe close to 100,000 nuclear weapons in the world. Today we have maybe around 10,000. During the Cold War, we had a policy of essentially mutually assured destruction, so that if they attacked us, we would attack them and everybody would lose everything. So it really created this powerful need not to go to war. And that in itself helped us have a period of stability and peace after World War II. But that a policy of mutual assured destruction is in tatters now. We don't have the Cold War anymore. A lot of the institutions that we set up to keep the peace have been weakened or just have really kind of faded in the background. And so we are now facing a world that is nuclearizing again, in a multipolar world where, as one country gains nuclear weapons, their neighbors who are afraid will want to get nuclear weapons as well. And that's a great challenge for us. This war is going to play a huge role in that challenge, because what happens in this war is going to help us also figure out how to live in a nuclear world. So those are some thoughts that I had. If you want to respond to this video, please do so. Just go ahead and post something on the discussion on the war on Blackboard, and I'm happy to reply. But thanks for listening. I wanted to talk to you. Hello, everyone. So I wanted to take some time to talk to you about the Ukraine war and the comments that you all made about it in the discussion. I thought they were very important things to talk about. I'm glad that you had a chance to say your piece about it. Okay.